Now, if you're wondering where the word for the FID flood zone, where flood zone and parcels and the other FID come from, they're coming from the two layers that we use to do the union with. Now, if you look at those names, again, we had land use and flood areas, but those were actually parts of geodatabases. And if you right click, for example, on land use and look at the properties, go to source. Oops, I was there. You'll notice that the feature class name is parcels for land use. So that's where the FID parcels is coming from. It's coming from the name and the feature class. And likewise, if you went into flood areas and looked at its feature class, you would see it's called flood zone. And there you can see that. And so that's where those names are coming from. And the FID field is just something that gets added as a result of that union. The neat thing here is that the values in that FID in those FID fields will contain a -1 in areas where they don't have the overlap. So, for example, for the areas where we have flood zone but did not have parcel data overlap, then we've got a -1 in the flood zone here. So if I go to the top of the table, you see we've got some numbers here. These are the actual flood zone numbers until you get to there. You see some -1s, and in this area we did not have overlap with the parcels. There was no parcel data there. And the numbers, like in flood zone again, where you do have numbers other than -1, what those numbers represent, they represent the parcel information. If I go into the, and I say parcel, which was the land use, if I go into the land use, let's see, I'm sorry, it's the flood areas. If I go into the flood areas, for example, I've highlighted here a 734, which was the object ID in that table. And if you go over here, you'll notice the zone name was Westdale Creek in 734. Then if I go into my union table and I find a value up in this flood zone of 734 right here, you'll see there's Westdale Creek. So you can tell that indeed is a match, that what this FID number here is, even though it says flood zone. Now what that is the object ID number that came out of the flood areas table. Okay, that's that piece of information. Likewise, if I look down here at this first one where I get -1s here in the flood zone, but I get positive numbers in this parcel category. If I look at the 3470 and I see this property description of Hut Andrew, I think it is, and if I go into the land use table and I look down for 3470, then I see there's the Hut Andrew again. So you can that just sort of verifies it to you. If you're like me, you like to know what's going on with these numbers. The book tells you the important thing here, which is that if there's a -1 in there, that's an area where you don't have the overlap that we're looking for. But when you have a positive number, you kind of want to know what that is too. So that's how you can sort of verify to yourself that the numbers in the FID flood zone represent the object ID numbers for the flood area table. And conversely, the numbers here in the FID parcels represent the object ID numbers out of the land use table. And I'm switching back and forth between the three tables here just so you can kind of see that. The book just focuses on your resulting table. So that's how you can see. And then if you continue scrolling down, so you notice here we've got areas where we have information that was in our flood areas layer, but we didn't have corresponding information in the land use area. And then vice versa here, we've got -1s in this flood zone category, which again represented areas in the flood areas. And then if you continue scrolling through the table, you'll see that there's some areas where you have positive numbers in both columns. And these are the areas that we're particularly interested in the areas where you've got information that are the non-1s in both columns. So that's areas where we have overlap in the same geographical location. We have overlap between the flood zones or the land use area and the flood areas. It's a little confusing again because these titles say flood zone and parcels, but just remember that's coming from the feature class data set. Okay, had these been shape files we were working with, those names would correspond to the name of the shape file. It would be a little more straightforward. But that's what's going on. So we're going to run a definition query, they call it, to basically isolate this area that you see that I've highlighted here. These areas where they're non-1s, we want to just display those areas. That's where we're getting to, so that we can run some analysis and summaries on that data. Now I'm going to close this table, but before I do, I want to point out something that's easy to do. That you have to remember. The book didn't mention this yet, but you need to remember this. When I was showing you the example and I was highlighting the records, notice I basically selected 1 out of 1,000 and something records that is there. That selection is it's still active. So if I run my analysis that we're going to run later, it's only going to perform it on that one selection because I selected an area. So before I close this table, or afterwards, I could do it either way, but I want to make sure that I clear all of my selections there because I don't need to perform it on just that one accidentally. So I'm going to go through and I'm going to do the same just to be safe for each of the 3 tables that I opened, in case we end up running any analysis there. So let's close each of those, and then we'll close each of the tables, just to be safe. Now if you're not already there, you want to click on this button over here on the top left to get back to your list by the drawing order, which is what the book says in step 6 there on page 117. And I'm going to follow right along with the book here. Then we want to right click on the flood area of study. Okay, I'm going to select it, and then right click, and we're going to go to properties. And then we want to go to the definition query tab, which is right here. And the definition query tab is basically a way to isolate a subset of data within that layer. So we're gonna select those records, like I mentioned before, that basically had positive values for both of those fields in them, and we want to just show that part of the layer. Now another thing we could have done is we could have went in there and selected these and created an entirely new data set with that, and that's actually a good thing to do in a lot of cases. And when you're doing things like your class projects and stuff like that, if you do any of this kind of analysis, you'll probably end up saving that selected data set as a new data set and working with that. But we're going to stick with the book and follow through the exercise the way they have it in the book, and we're basically going to build this definition query to isolate that subset of values. So the way we do this, we click on Query Builder, and that pops up this little dialog that you'll see this a lot over time from different perspectives. You'll see it selecting it in a different way than what we're doing it now. But here you have a list of all of the fields in that table to select from that are eligible to do analysis on, I should say. There might be some that are textual fields you might not see, but anyway, these are the fields that we're going to choose. We're going to choose the 2 FID fields out of this. And what we want to do this, okay, is we're going to build the query that they have on that example on page 117 on the lower right graphic. And we want to get FID flood zone. As we select from this list up here where my mouse is, we'll be adding it to this query down here. And you notice the query at the top of it sort of tells you what's going on. Right now it's just saying basically select everything from the flood area of study where, and nothing has been defined. Now this is what we call an SQL query, and a lot of you probably heard of SQL. SQL can be very meticulous and very tedious to type it in manually, and what ArcGIS has done for us is with this dialog it lets us more easily use the mouse to point and click and build an SQL query without having to type it in. Now you can type it in this box. That said, you can type it in manually if you wish, And a lot of times over time what you'll find is that you'll adjust your query once you've typed it in by doing it manually. In this case, we're going to do it just by clicking on things. So we want to go down the list and get on the FIT flood zone. And if I just click once on it, you notice nothing happens. What you have to do is you have to double click it. Okay? And you double click that, and then we're going to put basically is not equal to sign, which is basically the greater than and the less than sign. So if that's this right here, and we'll click that. And now when I did that, if you noticed in the chart, in the in the query down here that's being built, it automatically put a space in there for me. Okay, notice where the cursor is. If you can see that, there's not a space there right now. If I were to type a number in there, like say 56, there wouldn't be a space in there. And it's a good idea to have at least the one space in there. So now as you build the query, I'm going to backspace over, it will automatically put a space in there for you. But just remember for down the road, if you were typing anything manually in there, you'd have to remember to hit the space bar once when you start doing the typing yourself. So here we've got the not equal to, and then we want the and symbol, and we've got that handy here in our buttons as well. So I click the and again notice how it put the space in there before the and then we want to get the other FID, which was the parcels FID. So we'll double click again on it. Notice I single clicked on the and, so it's a little confusing, and you'll figure this out as you go, as you use this more. I don't know why they make some of them you have to double and some single, but you'll figure that out. So we've got that, and so now we're again going to do the not equal to, and you notice I left something out. Did anybody catch that? Before the and, I needed to put a -1 in there, and that's where we would have typed it in manually. So I'm going to click on I'm going to go back and put my cursor there before the first and I'm going to type -1, and I'm going to put a space. Okay, so we're building the query. We're selecting from this layer of flood area study where the FID flood zone is not equal to -1 and the FID parcels. I'm going to click at the end, and here we're going to go with not equal to again. Now I'm going to type in -1, but I want to put my space first. Put a space and then -1. Okay, and that's our query. We want the flood zones that are not equal to -1 and the parcels that are not equal to -1. And notice that and is real important because it's basically saying everything on the left hand side of this equation has to be true and everything on the right hand side of this equation has to be true to be in this selection that we're fixing to define. So it's basically again going to take the cases where you have both of those fields that have some positive number in them. Okay, that's the result. But that and is very important. Instead of if we had used or, which are some cases where you might, but if we had used or, then we would have got a very different resulting data set. And just for fun, think about, what do you think? Do you think we would have gotten more or less if we had used or? In other words, if we had put an or between here instead of and, would we have gotten more or less? We would have gotten more, right? Because we would have basically been saying this first part has to be true or the second part can be true. And we're going to most likely have more cases if that was the situation. To make both of the sides of the equation true is going to be less cases. So we're reducing our data set with that selection. And now we're going to click OK. Before we do, I just want to point out that this query builder will remember your last query. So if you were to run this again and open it all up again, it will remember what you typed in here. That's good and bad. Sometimes you're wanting to do a totally different query and you have to remember to delete it. You can click clear and that takes it away. And then a lot of times you're repeating it and you're glad that it does that. Or you're going to modify it a little bit and make a little change to your equation or something, and it's nice to have the other one in there. Another thing you can do is you can save this query, and that's kind of a cool thing to do. The book doesn't have you do that, but I'm going to do it here just for fun to show you how it would work. I'm going to route it to my my exercises folder to save it there. And I'm just going to call it, instead of, notice it's going to call it a .exp something. I'm going to name it tutorial, let's see, 42Q1 for query 1. And I don't have to type in the EXP because it will put it in it when it saves it. And that way, if I had wanted to load that, say I cleared this and I was starting fresh or I accidentally cleared it, I can just load that back by going in and go to my exercises, and it will look for any kind of expressions I built in there. I can open that and it puts it right back in there. Very handy feature, and it's something that didn't exist in the old ArcGIS, and it can save you a lot of time because your queries can get pretty meticulous over time, and so there are cases where that's been of real value to me to have that. Now the book says to verify your equation, which is always a good thing to do, and what that will do is just basically the program looks at it, and had I mistakenly typed in something non-logical there or forgot to put a space in a place where I needed one or so forth, it would have pointed that out to me that it was a problem. It may or may not have told me the correct solution to the problem, but at least I would have known there was a problem and I could have figured that out. Here everything is okay. It says it was verified. So we're going to click OK and run this thing. And we've clicked OK. That puts us back to the initial definition query that we started. In that dialog, we have to click OK there as well. And let it run. It doesn't take it very long. And then we've got, now we're basically, for this layer of flood area of study, we are displaying only the areas that met our criteria. Okay, and one way you can see this is by turning off the other layers, and you can see what we have there. And you can see that it's, notice that it's divided up into pieces, because again the union took the boundaries of both of those layers that we unioned together, and it retained all of those boundaries. So it basically cut that up into pieces. If I turn the flood areas on and I turn the flood area study off, so you can see that, you can see here, just for fun I'm going to zoom in a little bit so you can see what I'm trying to explain. Notice the boundaries. This was our initial flood area, and now I'm going to turn the new layer back on. And you can see how it's got all these extra boundaries in it, where those boundaries corresponded to the parcel data that was in this land use file. If I turn that on, you can see that. If I turn it, I'm going to turn the flood areas off, and now I've got just the land use on and the flood area of study. And I'm going to turn the flood area of study off so you can see, and it's a little confusing because the land use area, they have hidden the boundaries. Okay, in other words, if you look at the legend here, they've got it color coded, but they have turned the boundary, the outline colors off. If you notice that, they're all set to, it's just showing the red. For example, let me click on this. I'm going to click on the red for commercial, just for this little test so you can see what I'm talking about. And you notice the outline width is set to 0. If I set that outline width to 1, I can leave this to gray. It should show up. And I say OK, then notice my boundaries come in. And those boundaries, if you notice, are the same thing. If I turn my flood areas back on now, you notice that, I'm sorry, the flood area of study, you notice it's got those, that's the boundaries. So that's why you're seeing that. Okay. So what you're seeing in this layer and this flood area of study is the boundaries of both the flood areas and the land use areas that corresponded, that overlapped. And you can verify that just visually by looking at it, by doing what I've just shown you how to do. So that's just a little aside, but it's something that, if you're like me, you like to know what's going on behind the scenes. So I'm going to set this back like it was. I'm going to turn that outline back to 0. All that is really doing, again, is giving us the illusion that there's no boundaries, that it's just one solid land use there. And if you remember, they had the lot boundaries layer that we haven't done much with in this exercise. But if you turn that back on, you'll see those boundaries again. So that really the lot boundaries and the land use are spatially very much alike. They're almost one for one. They're just a different set of attribute data in the land use file than what there is in the lot boundaries file. So don't want to confuse you, but I just wanted to give you a little more explanation there about what's going on. So the real area of interest